Hi everyone. Welcome. Welcome to another Instagram live conversation from Springtide Research Institute. My name is Siana Garo and I'm a research intern with Springtide, and today I'll be joining my fellow research intern Brandon Wong. And so let's bring him in now. Welcome, Brandon.
Hey, Sion. Thanks. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm so glad to connect with you on this format today. As we get started, can you introduce yourself and highlight what led you to join the Race and Religion Lab this summer? And you can also talk about your pronouns if you're comfortable, where you live, your passion for this work, and some hobbies would be nice as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Sion. I'm super excited to be having this conversation today. Really looking forward to discussing some of the topics that we'll be talking about. But yeah, hey everyone. My name is Brandon. I use he, him pronouns. A little bit about me. Last year, I graduated from Pepperdine University, where I studied psychology and religion. Perhaps unsurprisingly, my sort of research interests lie at the intersection of those two worlds. I'm really curious about understanding sort of the ways that spirituality and religion and engaging in those things impact the well-being of young people, either for better or for worse. And so with that, obviously Springtide's work is super fascinating to me, and I've really wanted to get involved with it for some time now. And so, yeah, that led to me eventually being a part of that Race and Religion Lab this summer, which I'm super excited about and really grateful for. But that's a little bit about me. I'd love to hear a little bit of your background, Sion. What led you to be a part of the Race and Religion Lab, etc.?
Yes, so hi everyone. My name is Siana Garo. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a sophomore at Yale studying ethnicity, race, and migration, which connects a lot to why I joined the lab this summer. A lot of my interest lies within how colonialism affects us today, and that kind of connects to whether people have religious affiliations because of colonialism or reject certain religions because of colonialism, which is why this work has been really interesting for me. And then also like studying whether or not young people are still religious, and we're also going to talk about that today. Some hobbies: I enjoy hiking, I enjoy spending time with my friends and family, and weightlifting. Um, yeah, so in this conversation, as two members of Gen Z, we'll speak to our experiences of religious identity, our thoughts on affiliation and disaffiliation, and share some of the communities or spaces which we've experienced a sense of belonging. So now I'm wondering if you can first share some of your faith background and how you presently identify religiously or spiritually, if at all, Brandon.
Yeah, definitely. So I grew up in a movement of sort of non-denominational Christian churches, and so for the first sort of 20 years or so of my life, I was really involved in that. Grew up going to Sunday school, attending youth group, church camp, service trips, etc. Sort of you name it, I probably did it. And then when college came around, I continued on doing campus ministry stuff with the same group of churches, serving in sort of various leadership roles, etc. And then during the summer of 2020, following the death of George Floyd and all the unrest that ensued, I found myself hearing a lot of different voices claiming to be sort of quote unquote Christian, both inside and outside of the group of churches that I grew up in. Sort of saying, okay, this is what Jesus would be doing, or this is the correct Christian response to everything that's happening. Some people were very adamant that Jesus would be out there protesting and that that was the sort of proper Christian response to everything happening. Whereas there were other folks who were just as adamant that that is exactly not what he would be doing, or not what it meant to sort of be a Christian in this context. And so that sort of dissonance prompted for me sort of the first time where I was having to think about the idea that, okay, there are clearly a lot of different perspectives on what it means to be a Christian, and what it looks like to live out a Christian faith today. And so that really sort of prompted me then to think about, okay, so then what makes the Christianity that I'm choosing to live out, and what makes the church that I grew up in right? What gives us the right to say that we're the real Christians, or that we know exactly what it looks like to live out Christianity today. And so all of that sort of led me to on this to begin almost this journey of examining the different beliefs that had sort of been handed down to me, and parsing out sort of what it was that I really believed and the things that I had sort of just assented to without all that much thought. Um, so yeah, and so over the course of that journey, the last couple of years, I've started to sort of take a step back from the community that I was raised in, to the point that nowadays I don't really attend anything anymore. Um, but to answer your question a little bit more directly about how I identify at this point, I haven't landed anywhere in particular. Not really sure where things are headed exactly. And so I guess in that sense, I'd probably identify as more of a religious nun, more than anything at this point. But yeah, that's a little bit about me. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your faith background, Sion, and how you sort of identify with all of that.
Yeah, so yeah, similarly to you, I grew up in the church. I grew up Ethiopian Pentecostal. My dad is a deacon, so it's like going to church, Bible quizzing, Wednesday church, you name it. That was like my whole childhood. Um, as I got older, my church kind of like stopped catering to like young adults. So it's like it kind of led to me and my friends going to more like American non-denominational churches. So I guess I kind of like still agree with the teachings that I learned within the Pentecostal church, but I guess I more so identify as non-denominational, just a Protestant Christian currently. But you shared a part of your experience in joining the research and communication efforts for Springtide was to explore the story of religious affiliation as well as disaffiliation for you and your peers, Brandon. Springtide's research has sought to go beyond what faith or spirituality box do you check. Because when you look at emerging generations' religious identities and expressions, Springtide continues to see how Gen Z largely identifies as spiritual and or religious, even though that goes against the common narrative of young people. And Springtide's nationally representative research found that 77% of Gen Z considers themselves spiritual, and 68% of Gen Z maintains they are religious. And these are significant numbers. And that's why Springtide knows we must look at more than attendance and affiliation metrics to understand the spiritual and religious lives of young people. If one only looked at numbers of young people attending traditional religious institutions, it wouldn't provide the full story. And now I'm wondering if you can share your own experiences, Brandon. What is your own perception and viewpoint when it comes to Gen Z and the experience of religious disaffiliation?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot going on sort of in the religious landscape here in the US and honestly in the world, particularly amongst young people. Obviously, disaffiliation is a part of my story, as I've shared, and obviously spending the first sort of 20 years of my life really committed to this particular community. Obviously, taking a step back has been a big transition, but I've definitely heard a lot of stories, of friends or friends of friends who are in similar spots of having to sort of reevaluate, their faith and what it is that they really believe about what it means to live that out. Um, so yeah, I guess my own interest in religious disaffiliation is very personal, and it's been really meaningful to, get to know the stories of other folks who, while their stories are obviously different and unique, share some through lines with my own. And I think that's one big thing that's really important to understand, about the experience, the process of religious disaffiliation is just that, um, it's very different from one person to the next. While there might be these through lines and parallels that sort of connect stories generally, everyone's experience is unique, and the sort of reasons that people disaffiliate are just as diverse as the experiences themselves. And so I think that's one really big thing that comes to mind in thinking about Gen Z and religious disaffiliation is just that it's easy to say, oh, this person disaffiliated, but what that might mean or look like could be completely different from the next person. And I think that's one thing that I really appreciate about particularly the qualitative work that Springtide does. Obviously, I think numbers are really helpful in sort of giving us an overview of what's happening and sort of observing trends. But I think, the qualitative work that Springtide does fills in a lot of the gaps in understanding the complexity and nuance of what's happening, of why things are happening. And so, yeah, Yeah, I guess one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite authors, Rachel Held Evans, sort of sheds a little bit of light into one another trend that I've been thinking about a lot as it relates to Gen Z, religion, etc. That is, um, the quote is, "We want to bring our whole selves through the church doors without leaving our hearts and minds behind, without wearing a mask." And I think this quote really well encapsulates a lot of um, sentiments that I've heard from friends and peers about why they've either taken a step back or started to really sort of reckon with all of this. It's just that I think Gen Zers and young people um, are really looking for spaces where they can feel like they are allowed to be themselves, where they can be authentic. And I think what we're seeing is that a lot of these religious institutions aren't spaces where young people and Gen Zers feel like they can do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to note that I, I don't think any sort of religious institution or any institution in general is trying to be an unsafe space. I think most institutions are trying to make that a part of who they are.
Right.
Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's being experienced that way
Mm-hmm.
for young people. And so I think that's a really important thing to know. I think a lot of us really want to ask hard questions of our faith. We want to wrestle through things. But when it feels like there isn't space to do that, or when it feels like those questions or that wrestling isn't welcomed, I think it's hard to feel like there's really a space for us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think with that, we're seeing a lot of Gen Zers and young people pivot towards less traditional, less institutional ways of sort of seeking out and experiencing the sacred. Um, and I know that Springtide is doing a lot of sort of research on what that is starting to look like. Later this fall, I believe we're going to be releasing the State of Religion and Young People report for 2023, which is all about sort of understanding how young people are experiencing the sacred both inside and outside of sort of traditional spiritual and religious contexts. And so the report is looking specifically at um, the experiences that have been labeled sacred moments or sacred encounters, which are sort of being defined as experiences of deep wonder, awe, gratitude, deep truth, interconnectedness, things sort of that nature. And so that's definitely something to look forward to. Earlier this summer, I had the chance to do a little podcast episode with Marta, who's the head of community engagement here at Springtide, to share some of my own personal reflections on the idea of sacred moments, sacred encounters, and things like that. So that's something to look forward to on this upcoming season of Springtide's The Voices of Young People podcast. And so just like the report, it'll be looking at these sacred moments, sacred encounters, but it'll be providing a little bit more of an intimate and personal look into some of those findings. So for those of you who are podcast listeners out there, make sure to subscribe to that so that way you can be some of the first people to hear what's coming down the line. But yeah, with that, I'd love to hear. I think it would be really cool if Sion, you had any sort of sacred experience or sacred encounters that you'd be willing to share about, just so our watchers, our listeners here can get a sense of what that'll look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for me, a sacred moment is any time I worship. I talked about my blog post for Springtide about gospel music and how when I moved away to college, that was a sense of home for me. And for me, whenever I worship, it's like a time where I can kind of ignore everything that's happening in my life. Like, I can be stressed, I can be fighting for my life, but none of that exists whenever I'm worshiping. It's just me with God and like worshiping God, and then God also like blessing me for giving my praises. So it's a very peaceful time, a very emotional time, especially when I'm going through it. But it's a really peaceful thing that I find very sacred, and I also try to like implement that within my day-to-day life.
Gotcha. Gotcha. I appreciate you sharing that with us, Sion. Yeah, I got the chance to look over a little bit of some of the data that was collected for this forthcoming State of Religion and Young People report, and there were a number of people who shared sort of similar experiences of being able to sort of step back and let go of sort of everything else that's happening around them and just be present in sort of these sacred moments. And so it's cool to see that through line show through in what you shared. Um, but yeah, in addition to, so that's one through line that we see. There were three sort of main elements that really made sacred moments based on the qualitative data that we were analyzing. So the first one was that these sacred moments are extraordinary in the sense that they have this meaning that sets them apart from ordinary life in this special way. Um, the second was that sacred moments are really personal, meaning that they feel as though they've almost been tailor-made for the young person experiencing them, communicating deep truths that are specific and unique to them. And the third sort of element that define these sacred moments for young people is that they're relational, that they're marked by this sort of profound sense of interconnectedness, either to oneself, to others, or the universe. And so, yeah, it's interesting seeing how some of these elements connect to some of the things that you shared in your story, Sion. So thank you again for sharing all that.
Of course. And to build off of everything we've covered today, I was wondering if you could offer some examples of places or spaces where you've experienced a sense of belonging. And this could be any type of setting, but I'm particularly curious if there are communities or spaces where you found a sense of belonging in terms of your faith or spirituality.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are two contexts that sort of immediately jumped in front of mind. I think the first context is the sort of cohort or group of religion majors that I graduated with. Um, as we were going through the religion major, all of us were sort of obviously learning the same things, and a lot of that was um, gave us a lot of tools, I guess, to sort of think about the faith that we'd grown up with or inherited in different ways than we were used to. And so I think it prompted a lot of reflection and a lot of wrestling for each of us. And so I think it was really meaningful to be going through almost this hard thing of thinking through, like trying to reckon with, okay, what is it that I really believe? What is it that was sort of just handed down to me? Um, I think being able to do that all together and to know and also feel that I wasn't alone in that, I think was really, really meaningful. So I think that's sort of the first context that comes to mind. The other context that comes to mind is I became really good friends with one of my professors, one of my religion professors. Um, he also sort of grew up in the same movement of churches that I did. And so with that, he could really understand sort of where I was coming from and then some of the cultural baggage that I was bringing with me as I was wrestling with some of these questions of my faith. And so I think what was really helpful in cultivating the sense of belonging, particularly in that context, was just the fact that he knew where I was coming from, but that he also was really open to helping me think through the questions that I was asking. I think it was also really meaningful that he was a little bit further along in having reconciled some of these things for himself. So he was able to provide a little bit more guidance. But yeah, those are sort of the two things that jumped in front of mind to me in terms of spaces that felt like were really able to offer me belonging as I've wrestled through different questions in my faith. But yeah, I'd love to hear about any spaces or contexts or communities that have done a similar thing for you.
Yeah, for me, I would say the Given Pentecostal church that I honestly grew up in. Like I attended that church for as long as I know, and everyone there is of my background, and just like having people who are from the same culture and understand me, especially since a lot of the people who attend that church are immigrants. So people who are my age were
Mhm.
also children of immigrants. So it's like we all understand that we're in a different country than our native origin, and there's like a cultural boundary. And it was really nice to have youth pastors that kind of understood how sometimes there'd be a clash because of that, and it also, I guess, guide us in our faith. And I have like some of my best friends from that church today, and I just be attending a church that like is of my faith and then also representative of my culture just allowed me to kind
Mhm.
of reconcile the clash that I would have sometimes, um, being of a different culture and living in America. So I feel like that's where I really felt a sense of belonging. Um, but I just want to thank you all for joining the conversation today. We all want to thank you, Brandon, of course, for joining me today to talk about this. We all want to invite you to check out our research and the resources from Springtide Research by following us on social media at We Are Springtide, and then you can find our blog post, the podcast, Brandon, our data findings, and more online at springtideresearch.org.
Yep. And then for anyone who's interested in the research that Sion and I have been doing this summer, make sure to sign up for our Springtide email newsletter. If you're not already on that list, you can go to springtideresearch.org, just scroll to the bottom of the page, drop your email, and you'll get notified as soon as we release those findings. But thanks again, Sion, for having me. This was awesome.
Of course. Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.
See ya.
Bye.